Early morning, I was walking my old dog across the pasture when a metallic pink SUV came barreling toward my ranch gate. A blonde woman stepped out, clutching an HOA clipboard, and shouted over the fence, "I'm going to turn this place into a public park, whether you want it or not." At that moment, I just laughed. I never thought a threat like that would lead to police calls, subpoenas, and a community torn apart over a piece of land. If you've ever encountered someone in your neighborhood who thinks they're the self-appointed president of everything, drop their name in the comments below. I've got a story you can't miss. My name is Clayton Ward, and I'm a restoration architect specializing in historic structures. 3 years ago, I inherited this 50-acre ranch from my grandfather in Meadowbrook Hills, Texas. The property has been in our family since 1880, when my great-great-grandfather built the original log cabin that still stands today. The main house, barns, and riding trails represent more than just property to me. They're living history. Every morning, I'd walk the grounds, checking on the horses, maintaining the old structures, and feeling connected to generations of my family who called this place home. That particular Tuesday started like any other until the pink SUV arrived. The woman who emerged looked like she'd stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine, wearing designer jeans and a flowing scarf that screamed expensive. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. She marched up to my gate like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, looking around my property with calculating eyes. "You must be Clayton Ward," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Celeste Harmon, president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA and founder of the Green Community Initiative. We need to talk about your responsibility to this community." I set down the water bucket I'd been carrying and walked over to the fence, my old German Shepherd, Ranger, padding along beside me. "Good morning, Mrs. Harmon. What can I help you with?" I kept my tone friendly, though something about her demeanor immediately put me on edge. She had that particular look in her eyes that I'd seen before in people who mistake authority for entitlement. Celeste gestured broadly at my ranch, sweeping her arm across the pastures and outbuildings. "This community needs green space, Mr. Ward. A proper park where families can gather, children can play, and we can host community events. Your property here, it's exactly what we need for our vision of a sustainable, connected neighborhood." The audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. This woman was standing at my gate, looking at my family's century-old ranch, and talking about it like it was undeveloped land waiting for her approval. "I appreciate your interest in community development, Mrs. Harmon, but this is private property. It's been in my family for generations, and it's not for sale or conversion." I watched her face change as I spoke, the practiced smile faltering slightly. She pulled out her clipboard and made a note, her pen scratching aggressively against the paper. "Mr. Ward, I think you misunderstand the situation here. This isn't really about what you want. It's about what's best for everyone. We have ways of ensuring that private property serves the greater good." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I dealt with plenty of difficult clients in my restoration work, people who thought money or influence could override historical preservation laws or architectural integrity. But this felt different. This woman wasn't trying to hire me or negotiate with me. "Mrs. Harmon, I respect your passion for community development, but my family's ranch isn't part of your HOA jurisdiction, and it's not available for conversion into anything else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." I turned to walk away, hoping that would end the conversation, but her voice followed me across the yard. "We'll see about that, Mr. Ward. I've successfully converted 2 other private properties into community spaces, and both neighborhoods are better for it. You'll change your mind once you understand how much the community needs this." Her tone had shifted from fake friendliness to barely concealed hostility. "The Green Community Initiative has resources you haven't even considered yet." This conversation isn't over. She climbed back into her pink SUV and drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway with an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. Ranger looked up at me with those wise old eyes, and I scratched behind his ears. "What do you think, boy? Should we be worried about the lady in the pink truck?" He just wagged his tail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Celeste Harmon was going to be a much bigger problem than I'd initially thought. The next few days passed quietly, and I almost convinced myself that Celeste Harmon had moved on to easier targets. I should have known better. It started with small things. Neighbors I'd never spoken to suddenly giving me odd looks when I drove through the subdivision to reach the main road. Then my friend Jake, who lives in the HOA, called me with a strange question. "Hey Clayton, someone posted in our community group asking about your ranch. Something about maintenance issues and whether it's properly zoned?" That was my first clue that Celeste hadn't forgotten about our conversation. She'd just changed tactics. I decided to do some research of my own. The Meadowbrook Hills community had its own social media group, and while I wasn't a member since my ranch predated the subdivision, I could see some of the public posts. What I found made my blood run cold. Celeste had been busy crafting a narrative about my property that painted me as an irresponsible landowner standing in the way of community progress. One afternoon, I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. Someone had planted a handmade wooden sign in front of my ranch gate, painted in bright red letters. "Future site of Meadowbrook Hills Public Park, funded by Green Community Initiative." No signature, no explanation. This brazen act, so public and confident, made my blood run cold. This wasn't rumors or social media posts anymore. This was public claim staking, turning speculation into assumed fact. The comments section was even more telling. Several people I didn't recognize were chiming in with enthusiastic support for repurposing underutilized land for community benefit. It all felt orchestrated, like Celeste had assembled a small army of supporters to amplify her message. I screenshot everything I could find and started a file on my computer. My instincts told me I was going to need documentation of everything that happened from this point forward. That's when I decided to dig deeper into Celeste Harmon herself, and what I found explained a lot about her confidence in threatening me. The Green Community Initiative turned out to be more than just a local hobby group. Celeste had built a legitimate organization with a track record of community improvement projects across Texas. Her website featured before and after photos of 2 previous projects, both involving private land that had been converted into public spaces. The language was all about partnership and mutual benefit, but reading between the lines I could see a pattern. In both cases, elderly property owners had been convinced or pressured to sell their land below market value for the greater good of community development. One case involved a small farm that became a dog park. Another was a historic homestead that became a community garden. And what really caught my attention was the funding structure. The Green Community Initiative received grants from environmental groups, matched by donations from local businesses and developers. It was a clever system, appearing to be grassroots community activism while actually being backed by serious money. I found articles in local newspapers praising Celeste's work, calling her a visionary community leader and champion of sustainable development. But I also found a few buried complaints on community forums, people who felt they'd been manipulated or pressured by her organization. One anonymous post particularly stood out. "She makes you feel selfish for wanting to keep your own property, like you're standing in the way of everything good and progressive." The more I researched, the more I understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't just some overzealous HOA president with delusions of grandeur. Celeste Harmon was a professional at this, someone who had turned community activism into a lucrative career. She knew exactly how to apply pressure, how to build public opinion, and how to make property owners feel isolated and unreasonable for wanting to keep what was theirs. The 2 previous properties she'd converted had both been owned by elderly people without much family support or legal resources. I wasn't elderly, but as a single guy working from home, I didn't exactly have a built-in support system either. That evening, I called my lawyer, Lauren Beckett, who had handled my grandfather's estate and knew the history of the ranch property. "Lauren, I need to understand exactly what rights an HOA has regarding private property that predates their development." Her response was both reassuring and concerning. "Clayton, if your ranch was never part of the original HOA agreement, they have absolutely no legal authority over your property. But that doesn't mean they can't make your life difficult through other channels. Have you been getting any official notices or complaints from county offices?" I told her about the social media campaign, and she immediately advised me to document everything and be prepared for escalation. "People like this don't usually give up after one conversation," Lauren warned me. "If she's done this before successfully, she's going to keep pushing until she finds your pressure point. Make sure all your permits and paperwork are in order, because she'll probably try to find violations or create problems through official channels." As I hung up the phone, I looked out my kitchen window at the ranch that had been my family's sanctuary for over a... The old barn stood silhouetted against the sunset, the same view my grandfather had enjoyed every evening. I wasn't going to let some self-appointed community activist take that away, no matter how professional her operation might be. 2 weeks after the social media campaign began, I received a formal invitation to attend a special community meeting regarding land use and community development opportunities. The invitation came on official HOA letterhead, signed by Celeste Harmon in her capacity as president. It was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, and while it was phrased as an invitation, the tone made it clear that my attendance was expected, not requested. I called Lauren immediately to run the situation past her, and her advice was simple. Go to the meeting, bring a witness, and record everything legally possible. I arrived at the community center that Thursday to find a much larger crowd than I'd expected. The main conference room was packed with at least 60 people, most of whom I didn't recognize from my limited interactions with the neighborhood. Celeste had clearly been busy drumming up attendance, and from the snippets of conversation I overheard, many people had been told this was about exciting new community development opportunities. I took a seat toward the back of the room and pulled out my phone to record audio, making sure the recording function was visible to anyone who might object. Celeste opened the meeting with a polished presentation that could have come from a professional development firm. She had a laptop connected to a projector, displaying slides about community green space, sustainable development, and maximizing neighborhood potential. Her speaking style was confident and practiced, clearly someone who had given this presentation before. Tonight, we have an incredible opportunity to discuss how our community can grow and thrive together. We're going to talk about vision, about possibility, and about how sometimes individual sacrifice creates collective benefit. The crowd was nodding along, clearly drawn in by her professional demeanor and inspiring language. Then she clicked to a slide that made my stomach drop. It was an aerial photograph of my ranch, clearly taken recently, with digital overlays showing proposed improvements. The image showed my property transformed into a public park, complete with walking trails, picnic areas, a playground, and a large community garden. She had obviously put significant time and effort into creating this visualization, making my ranch look like a neglected eyesore that could become a neighborhood jewel with the right intervention. This property represents an amazing opportunity for our community. 50 acres of underutilized land that could serve hundreds of families instead of sitting empty. I felt my face getting hot as she continued her presentation, describing my family's ranch as if it were abandoned property, waiting for someone to give it purpose. She talked about the potential of the land, the needs of the community, and the responsibility of property owners to consider the greater good. Not once did she mention that this was private property with a century of family history, or that the current owner had never expressed any interest in selling or converting it. She presented the whole thing as if my consent was just a minor administrative detail to be worked out later. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood up and identified myself. I'm Clayton Ward, the owner of the property you've been discussing. I'd like to clarify a few things for everyone here tonight. The room went quiet, and I could feel dozens of eyes turning to look at me. First, this property has been in my family since 1880. It's not unused or underutilized. It's a working ranch with horses, maintained buildings, and active agricultural use. Second, it was never part of the original HOA agreement when this subdivision was developed. Third, it's not for sale, not for conversion, and not available for community use in any form. The reaction in the room was immediate and divided. Some people looked surprised, clearly not having been told that the property owner hadn't agreed to this plan. Others looked annoyed, as if I was being unreasonably stubborn about something that obviously benefited everyone. But the biggest shock came from someone I least expected, Tiffany Chen, the HOA communications coordinator who had been Celeste's right-hand person. After my presentation, Tiffany stood up, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay silent anymore. Here's an internal email Celeste sent me asking me to modify the neighborhood map to show Mr. Ward's land as a proposed park site. I had no idea things had gone this far." The meeting room erupted. Celeste's face went from pale white to burning red. That's when I pulled out my folder of research and historical documents. "I'd be happy to help everyone understand the bigger picture," I said, walking toward the front of the room. "This ranch has been continuously owned and operated by my family for over 140 years. Here's the original land grant, here's the survey from 1895, and here's the county zoning map showing that this property has never been part of any homeowners association." I spread the documents on the table where everyone could see them, the old papers and official seals creating a stark contrast to Celeste's slick, digital presentation. The mood in the room shifted as people began to understand what was really happening. This wasn't a community leader presenting an opportunity for mutual benefit. This was someone trying to pressure a private property owner into giving up land that had never been offered for sale. Several people in the audience started talking among themselves, and I heard more than one person say something like, "I didn't know he hadn't agreed to this," or "Why didn't she mention it was private property?" Celeste tried to regain control of the meeting, but the damage was done. Her carefully orchestrated presentation had backfired when confronted with actual facts and documentation. As people started to leave, several came up to me privately to apologize and express support. "I had no idea she was talking about taking someone's family land," one elderly woman told me. "That's not the kind of community development I want to be part of." But not everyone was sympathetic. I overheard Celeste talking to a small group of supporters near the exit, her voice carrying across the room. Sometimes people need to understand that their individual rights don't override community needs. We have legal options we haven't explored yet. It was clear that this public confrontation hadn't ended her campaign. It had just pushed her to escalate to the next level. The week following the community meeting, I thought I might have finally gotten through to Celeste Harmon. The social media posts had stopped, and I hadn't seen her pink SUV cruising past my ranch. I should have known that silence from someone like her didn't mean surrender. It meant she was planning something bigger. That became clear on Monday morning when I was woken up at 7 a.m. by a knock on my door from a county building inspector who had received an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures and potential safety violations on my property. "I'm sorry to bother you so early, Mr. Ward, but we got a detailed complaint about this property that we're required to investigate," the inspector, a tired-looking man named Rodriguez, explained. He showed me a printed form that listed nearly a dozen alleged violations, from unpermitted additions to the house to claims that I was operating an illegal boarding stable. I have to go through this list item by item, but honestly, most of these complaints look pretty questionable to me. Someone really has it out for you. I invited him in for coffee and spent the next 3 hours walking him through every building and structure on the property, showing him permits, inspection records, and documentation going back decades. Rodriguez was professional and thorough, but as we went through each alleged violation, it became clear that someone had spent considerable time studying my property to create this list of complaints. "Whoever filed this report knows your property pretty well," he told me as we finished the inspection. "They mentioned specific outbuildings, fence locations, even details about your septic system. This wasn't just someone driving by and guessing about violations. Every single complaint turned out to be false or based on misunderstanding of agricultural property regulations. But the inspection took most of my day and created an official record that someone was questioning my property maintenance." That afternoon, I received a call from the county animal control office. Someone had reported that I was keeping dangerous exotic animals on my property without proper permits. The officer who called was apologetic but explained that they were required to investigate any report of potentially dangerous animals, especially on properties near residential areas. The complaint mentioned large aggressive dogs, possibly wolf hybrids, and claims that neighbors had been threatened by these animals. She explained, "I looked over at Ranger, my 12-year-old German Shepherd who spent most of his day napping in the sun and had to suppress a laugh. Officer, you're welcome to come out and meet my vicious attack dog, but I think you'll find the report has been somewhat exaggerated." The pattern continued throughout the week. On Wednesday, a social services investigator showed up to check on reports of unsafe living conditions on my property. On Friday, the fire marshal arrived to investigate claims of improper storage of hazardous materials. Each investigation was professional and thorough, and each one cleared my property of any violations or problems. But the cumulative effect was exhausting and invasive. I was spending more time dealing with government inspectors than working on my restoration projects, and I could see exactly what was happening. Someone was systematically trying to make my life miserable through bureaucratic harassment. The breaking point came when I discovered that someone had been making videos on my property without permission. A neighbor called to tell me she'd seen people with cameras near my back fence line, and when I investigated, I found fresh footprints in several spots where the fence wire had been cut and repaired. That evening, I installed motion-activated trail cameras around the entire perimeter of my property. If someone was gathering evidence to use against me, I wanted evidence of my own. The next morning, I reviewed the footage and found exactly what I expected. Clear video of 2 people, one of whom looked remarkably like Celeste Harmon, trespassing on my property and filming my outbuildings. I immediately called Lauren Beckett with the video evidence, and her response was swift and decisive. "Clayton, this has gone way beyond legitimate community advocacy. This is harassment, trespassing, and possibly criminal conspiracy. We need to document everything and consider filing complaints of our own. She advised me to compile all the inspection reports, the video evidence, and the pattern of complaints into a comprehensive file. If this escalates any further, we're going to need to show that there's been a systematic campaign of harassment directed at you by someone with clear motives to pressure you into selling your property. That weekend, I spent hours organizing all the documentation I'd gathered about Celeste Harmon and her organization. The pattern was becoming clearer with every piece of evidence I assembled. The Green Community Initiative had used similar tactics in their previous successful projects, overwhelming property owners with bureaucratic problems until selling seemed like the easiest solution. What they hadn't counted on was dealing with someone who understood the value of documentation and had the resources to fight back. As I sat in my grandfather's old study, surrounded by legal papers and investigation reports, I realized that this wasn't just about my ranch anymore. This was about standing up to a system of sophisticated bullying that had probably worked on other people who didn't have the knowledge or support to resist it. Looking out the window at the land my family had protected for generations, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just defend my property. I was going to expose what Celeste Harmon was really doing to the community she claimed to serve. It was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back, with the same level of organization and determination she had been using against me. The next morning, I made a list of phone calls that would change everything. To a journalist I knew who specialized in local corruption stories, to other property owners who had dealt with the Green Community Initiative, and to the State Attorney General's office that investigated fraudulent nonprofit organizations. If Celeste wanted a war, she was about to discover that some opponents are more prepared for battle than others. After 2 weeks of bureaucratic harassment and illegal surveillance, I decided it was time to stop reacting and start acting. My first call was to Emma Rodriguez, an investigative journalist with the Austin Tribune who specialized in local government corruption and nonprofit fraud. I'd met Emma a few years earlier when she was researching a story about historic preservation, and I knew she had a reputation for thorough, fair reporting that held powerful people accountable. When I explained the situation with Celeste Harmon and the Green Community Initiative, Emma's interest was immediately piqued. "Clayton, what you're describing sounds like a pattern I've seen before with other so-called community advocacy groups. Would you be willing to go on the record with documentation?" Within 24 hours, Emma had agreed to investigate the story and was already reaching out to other people who had dealt with Celeste's organization. Meanwhile, I was implementing my own strategy to reclaim the narrative in my community. Instead of letting Celeste control the conversation through her social media campaigns and private meetings, I decided to invite the entire neighborhood to see my property for themselves. I spent the weekend preparing for what I called Ranch Heritage Day, an open house where anyone could come see what Celeste was trying to destroy and understand why it was worth preserving. The preparations for Ranch Heritage Day gave me a chance to really look at my property through other people's eyes. I spent hours organizing the old photographs my grandfather had saved, documenting the ranch's history from its founding in 1880 through its evolution into the present day. I cleaned and organized the old barn, set up display boards showing the architectural significance of the buildings, and prepared guided tours that would help visitors understand what they were looking at. Most importantly, I reached out to other family members and longtime neighbors who could speak to the ranch's role in the area's history. My cousin Sarah drove up from San Antonio with a box of family documents and photographs I'd never seen before. "Grandpa always said this place was the heart of the community before there was even a community," she told me as we went through the old pictures. "Look at this one from 1943, when they held the county fair here every summer. And this one from the 50s, when the volunteer fire department used the barn for their fundraising dances." The photographs told a story of a ranch that had always been connected to the community, not separate from it. This wasn't isolated private property. It was a place where generations of neighbors had gathered for celebrations, emergencies, and shared experiences. That morning, I didn't just welcome over 200 community members. Something unexpected happened. A YouTuber who specializes in exposing HOA overreach, who had been following the situation through live streams, showed up and filmed an entire video called "The Landkeeper Copyright: When HOA Power Grabs Become Land Grabs." Within 48 hours, the video had attracted 600,000 views. In the comments, hundreds of people shared their own stories of being pressured by HOAs to sell their land, and declared they wouldn't stay silent anymore. The most powerful moment came when Mrs. Henderson, an 80-year-old woman from the original Meadowbrook community, stood up during one of the tours and shared her own memories. "I learned to ride horses right here in this paddock when I was 7 years old," she told the crowd. "Clayton's grandfather taught half the children in this county how to handle animals safely and respect the land. This ranch has been a blessing to this community for longer than most of us have been alive." Her words carried the weight of lived experience that no amount of professional presentation slides could match. As people were leaving that afternoon, many stopped to thank me and express their support for keeping the ranch as it was. Several offered to help if I needed volunteers for property maintenance or legal support. One man, who introduced himself as Bob Mitchell from the HOA community, pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know that not everyone in our neighborhood supports what Celeste Harmon is doing. A bunch of us have been talking, and we think she's gotten way out of line with this whole campaign against you. If you need people to speak up at the next HOA meeting, you've got supporters." But the most significant development came from Emma Rodriguez, who had spent the day interviewing visitors and documenting the event. As people were heading home, she approached me with news that changed everything. "Clayton, I've been making some calls about Celeste Harmon's previous projects, and I think you need to know what I've found. Those 2 successful conversions she's so proud of, both of them involved elderly property owners who were pressured into selling their land for significantly less than market value. In one case, the family is now claiming they were misled about what would happen to their father's property." Emma's investigation had also uncovered financial irregularities in the Green Community Initiative's funding structure. The grant money and donations that fund her organization, most of it comes from development companies that benefit when private land gets converted to public use. It's not technically illegal, but it's definitely not the grassroots community activism she presents it as. This is a business model, Clayton, and you're the next target. Armed with this information and the overwhelming community support from Ranch Heritage Day, I finally felt like I had the tools to fight back effectively against Celeste's campaign. That evening, as I walked through my property, picking up the remnants of the day's celebration, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: optimism. The community had seen the truth about my ranch and had rejected Celeste's narrative of neglect and selfishness. More importantly, the investigation into her organization was revealing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond legitimate community advocacy. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I might actually win this fight, not just survive it. The success of Ranch Heritage Day clearly rattled Celeste Harmon more than I had anticipated. Within 48 hours of the event, I could see that she was escalating her tactics in ways that seemed increasingly desperate and poorly planned. It started with a flurry of angry posts on social media, where she accused me of manipulating public opinion and staging propaganda events to avoid my responsibility to the community. Her usual polished messaging had devolved into emotional rants that made her sound less like a professional activist and more like someone losing control of a situation she had expected to dominate easily. The first sign that she was moving into truly dangerous territory came when she started claiming that Ranch Heritage Day had been a safety violation that put children at risk. According to her online post, my property was full of uncontrolled hazards and dangerous animals that made it unsuitable for public access. Never mind that over 200 people, including dozens of children, had spent hours on my property without a single incident or injury. Never mind that I had liability insurance and had followed all the proper protocols for hosting a public event. Celeste was now creating an entirely fictional narrative about dangers that existed only in her imagination. But her most reckless decision was to start live streaming what she called community safety patrols near my property. These weren't official patrols authorized by any government agency or legitimate organization. They were just Celeste and a few supporters driving slowly past my ranch while she provided commentary about ongoing safety concerns and the need for community vigilance. Live streams were clearly designed to create the impression that my property was some kind of ongoing threat that required constant monitoring by concerned citizens. The live streaming campaign backfired spectacularly when Celeste decided to escalate to actually entering my property without permission. I was working in the barn when I heard voices near the main gate, and when I looked outside, I could see Celeste with her phone held up, clearly recording while she talked loudly about investigating reports of unsafe conditions. She had opened my gate and was walking up the driveway toward my house, narrating her trespassing for her online audience. As you can see, there are no proper safety barriers here, and I can smell what might be hazardous chemicals coming from these outbuildings. I called out to her from about 50 feet away. Mrs. Harmon, you're on private property without permission. I need you to leave immediately. Her response was to turn the camera toward me and continue her narration. And here we can see the property owner who becomes aggressive when community members try to address legitimate safety concerns. I was standing calmly in my own driveway, speaking in a normal voice, but she was describing me as if I was somehow threatening her. This is exactly the kind of hostile behavior that makes this property unsuitable for family use. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of escalating the confrontation, I simply walked back into my barn and called the police. Not 911 for an emergency, but the non-emergency line for the sheriff's department. I have someone trespassing on my property who is refusing to leave when asked, I explained calmly. She's live streaming the trespassing on social media, so there should be plenty of documentation of what's happening. The dispatcher told me an officer would be there within 20 minutes, and I settled in to wait while Celeste continued her investigation outside. What I didn't expect was that the responding officer would be Sean Decker, someone I'd known since high school who was now a deputy with the county sheriff's department. Sean and I had reconnected a few years earlier when he'd helped with traffic control during a large family reunion at the ranch, and he was familiar with both my property and my reputation in the community. When he arrived and saw Celeste still live streaming her trespassing, his expression immediately told me that he understood exactly what was happening. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop recording and step off this private property," Sean told Celeste in his professional officer voice. But instead of complying, she turned her phone toward him and continued her live stream. "Officer, I'm so glad you're here. This property owner has been preventing the community from addressing serious safety violations, and when concerned citizens try to investigate, he becomes hostile and threatening." Sean looked at me, then back at Celeste, and I could see him trying to figure out how to handle someone who was clearly detached from reality. "Ma'am, you're currently trespassing on private property while live streaming without the owner's consent. That's not investigating safety violations, that's criminal behavior." Sean's tone was becoming more stern as Celeste continued to argue with him while keeping her phone camera running. "I'm going to need you to end that live stream, leave this property immediately, and understand that if you return without permission, you'll be arrested for criminal trespass." But Celeste wasn't finished with her performance yet, and what she did next would end up being broadcast live to dozens of her followers. "Officer, you don't understand the situation here," she said, her voice getting louder and more agitated. "This man has been threatening community members, preventing legitimate safety inspections, and creating a public nuisance with his dangerous animals and hazardous storage. I have every right as a community leader to investigate these conditions." Then she turned back toward me and pointed dramatically. "He's been intimidating anyone who questions his property use, and I have witnesses who will testify that he's made threats against community members who just want their neighborhood to be safe." That's when Sean asked the question that would unravel everything. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation of these threats or safety violations you're claiming?" Celeste's live stream was still running as she fumbled through her purse looking for something to support her claims, and her online audience was watching her struggle to produce any evidence for the dramatic accusations she'd been making. "I have reports from concerned citizens. I have documentation of his refusal to cooperate with community safety initiatives, and I have video evidence of his hostile behavior toward legitimate community concerns." But when Sean asked to see this documentation, all Celeste could produce were her own social media posts and the complaint she had filed with various county offices, all of which had been investigated and found to be without merit. As her live stream continued to broadcast, her carefully constructed image as a professional community advocate crumbled in real time. She was just someone who had convinced herself that her personal agenda was more important than property rights, trespassing laws, or basic respect for other people's boundaries. The dozens of people watching her live stream were seeing her true character for the first time, and the comment section was not kind. The live stream of Celeste's meltdown on my property became the catalyst for everything that followed. Within hours of Sean Decker escorting her off my ranch, the video had been shared across multiple community groups and social media platforms. But more importantly, it had been seen by several people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence to take action against Celeste and her organization. The first call I received was from Marcus Harmon, Celeste's own husband, who asked if he could meet with me privately to discuss what he called a very difficult situation. Marcus arrived at my ranch the next morning looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. As a real estate attorney, he had been watching his wife's escalating behavior with growing concern, knowing that her tactics were crossing legal lines that could expose both of them to serious consequences. "Clayton, I need you to understand that I never supported or approved of what Celeste has been doing to you," he told me as we sat on my front porch. "I've been trying to convince her to stop this campaign for weeks, but she's become obsessed with this project. Yesterday's live stream was the final straw for me." What Marcus revealed changed my understanding of everything that had happened. Celeste Green Community Initiative was largely funded by a development company that Marcus represented in his legal practice, creating a massive conflict of interest that neither of them had properly disclosed. The company has been pushing Celeste to deliver on her promises to convert private land into public space because they benefit when property values in surrounding areas increase, Marcus explained. But what started as legitimate community development has turned into something that could destroy both our careers and our marriage. Marcus had brought with him a box of documents that detailed the financial structure of the Green Community Initiative, including contracts and correspondence that showed how Celeste's grassroots activism was actually a coordinated business operation. "I'm filing for divorce and withdrawing my legal services from both Celeste and her organization," he told me. "But more importantly, I'm prepared to testify about the fraud and misrepresentation that's been happening if this goes to court. What she's done to you isn't activism, it's extortion." The second major development came from Emma Rodriguez's investigation, which had expanded far beyond just my situation. She had contacted the families affected by Celeste's previous, successful projects and had uncovered a pattern of misrepresentation and financial manipulation that went back several years. "Clayton, I think you should know that the State Attorney General's office is now investigating the Green Community Initiative for nonprofit fraud," Emma told me over the phone. "Your case provided the final piece of evidence they needed to prove that this organization has been systematically defrauding both property owners and donors." But perhaps the most satisfying development was what happened within the Meadowbrook Hills HOA itself. Bob Mitchell, the HOA resident who had supported me during Ranch Heritage Day, had been quietly organizing other homeowners who were uncomfortable with Celeste's tactics. At the next monthly HOA meeting, they presented a motion of no confidence in Celeste's leadership, supported by over 60% of the community members. "We elected Celeste to manage our homeowners association, not to harass our neighbors or launch personal vendettas against private property owners," Bob explained to the packed meeting room. The meeting was apparently quite dramatic, with Celeste attempting to defend her actions by claiming that everything she had done was for the good of the community. But when Bob presented video evidence of her trespassing on my property and her pattern of false complaints to county offices, the homeowners voted unanimously to remove her from her position as HOA president. More significantly, they voted to formally apologize to me on behalf of the community and to ensure that no HOA resources would ever again be used to harass private property owners. The legal consequences came swiftly after that. Within a week of her removal from the HOA presidency, Celeste was facing criminal charges for trespassing, filing false reports, and harassment. The State Attorney General's office filed civil charges related to nonprofit fraud and misuse of grant money. The development company that had been funding her organization immediately cut all ties and demanded repayment of funds that had been misused. Even the environmental groups that had supported her work began distancing themselves from her organization once the true nature of her tactics became public. But the most personally satisfying outcome was what happened to my ranch itself. The county commissioners, embarrassed by the harassment I had endured from multiple county offices based on Celeste's false complaints, fast-tracked my application to have the ranch designated as a county historical landmark. The designation not only protected the property from future development pressure, but also qualified it for grants to help maintain the historic buildings and agricultural operations. What Celeste had tried to destroy through harassment and manipulation had instead become officially recognized as a community treasure worth preserving. 6 months after that first encounter with the pink SUV, I hosted the second annual Ranch Heritage Day, this time with official county support and sponsorship from local historical organizations. Over 500 people attended, including many of the same HOA community members who had initially been swayed by Celeste's presentation. The event raised enough money to fund restoration work on the original 1880 cabin and to establish an educational program about 19th century ranching and land conservation practices. As I watched families exploring the property that Celeste had tried to steal from me, I reflected on what the whole experience had taught me about the difference between real community building and manipulative activism. True community leadership brings people together around shared values and mutual respect. It doesn't tear people down to advance personal agendas. Standing on the same porch where my grandfather had welcomed neighbors for decades, I realized that the best way to honor his legacy wasn't just to preserve the land he had protected, but to continue his tradition of making it a place where the community could gather, learn, and connect with their shared history. 1 month later, I received an email from a family in Colorado. We almost sold our farm after being pressured by our HOA, but thanks to the green community scam video shared from your ranch, we stopped just in time. The pink SUV never returned to my ranch, but the lessons from that confrontation continue to influence how I think about property rights, community responsibility, and the importance of standing up to bullies who wrap their personal agendas in the language of social justice. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not just for yourself, but for the principle that individuals have the right to make their own decisions about their own property, regardless of how persuasively others might argue that they know better.